My name is Elena Hargrove. I'm 32 years old, a graphic designer living in Portland, Oregon. And this morning, I woke up to 29 missed calls from an Illinois number. I stared at that screen so long my coffee turned ice cold in my grip because somewhere deep in my gut, before I heard a single voicemail, I already knew. Some memories don't fade. They don't disappear. They just wait, crouched silently in the shadows of your life, until one perfectly ordinary morning, they reach out and drag you all the way back to who you used to be. For me, it took one number. One flashing screen. And suddenly, I was 12 years old again, standing alone inside Union Station in Chicago, watching the only two people in the world who were supposed to protect me turn my terror into their entertainment. My mother left me at a train station. On purpose. As a joke. They laughed. They actually placed a bet on whether I could find my way home alone. I still remember the exact moment my stomach dropped when the truth hit me that they weren't circling back. Every face in that massive station looked like a stranger. The whole city felt enormous, deafening, freezing cold for a little girl with less than $10 in her pocket. That was the day my entire life cracked into two distinct versions of itself. The girl I had been before that moment. And the person I was forced to become after it. I never went back. Not that night. Not the following week. Not ever. I constructed a different life, a different name, a future so far removed from them that on most days, I could almost convince myself they no longer existed anywhere in the world. But this morning, those 29 missed calls proved something I had spent 2 full decades desperately trying to bury. The past doesn't always stay where you abandon it. Sometimes it comes hunting for you. Growing up in Millbrook, Illinois taught me one thing above everything else. In my family, appearances were everything. To our neighbors, we looked rock solid. Respectable. The kind of middle-class American household people held up as proof that hard work and solid values still meant something. My parents operated a small but profitable chain of home goods stores, places that sold kitchen appliances, bedding, discount coffee makers, and every random household item people forgot they needed until they walked past a colorful display. On weekends, my father grilled in the backyard. My mother waved cheerfully at neighbors over the fence. Everyone played along, acting like we were building something worth admiring. But inside those walls, love was always conditional. Safety depended on whether my mother was bored enough to manufacture another lesson. That was her favorite word. Lesson. If I cried, I was too sensitive. If I asked for help, I was helpless. If I forgot something, I needed to learn responsibility. She had a gift for transforming any ordinary childhood mistake into a reason to humiliate me, and my father always backed her up with a grin, as though cruelty were a team sport they both thoroughly enjoyed. When I was 8, I asked for new sneakers at the mall because my old ones were splitting apart at the toes. My mother announced I was being spoiled, walked me to a bench near the food court, and told me that if I wanted to survive the real world, I could start by sitting there alone and learning that nobody owed me anything. They left me there for nearly 3 hours. I remember staring at the pretzel stand, smelling cinnamon and butter, fighting back tears because crying only seemed to amuse them. When they finally returned, my father laughed and asked whether he owed my mother $20, since he'd guessed I'd still be glued to the same bench. When I was 10, I cried after a youth soccer game because a group of kids had mocked me in the parking lot. Instead of comfort, my parents drove to the far end of the lot, told me to get out, and left me there after dark because, according to my mother, tears made people weak, and weakness attracted worse treatment. I sat on a concrete curb with my arms wrapped around my knees, watching cars pull away one by one, until they finally returned nearly an hour later with fast food for themselves and not a word of apology for me. My father thought it was hilarious that I hadn't moved. He said he'd bet I would try to hitch a ride or beg strangers for help. That was the pattern. Everything became a test. Everything became a joke at my expense. Everything became a vehicle for proving that the world was brutal, as though they needed to make it any harder than it already was. The strangest part? They never once thought of themselves as cruel. They spoke constantly about character and grit and preparing me for reality. They used sophisticated language to make ugly things sound noble. If anyone had asked them, they would have sworn they were raising an independent daughter. But independence wasn't what they were building. Fear was. Hypervigilance was. Silence was. I learned to read their moods before speaking. I learned to make myself invisible inside my own home. I learned that if I stayed quiet enough, useful enough, small enough, maybe I could move through a day without being chosen for one of their experiments. The only place I ever felt real was on paper. I drew constantly on the backs of grocery receipts, in the margins of school assignments, on cheap sketch pads I bought with babysitting money. I drew bedrooms with locks on the doors, train windows filled with golden light, women standing alone on mountaintops with no one standing behind them. At 12, I couldn't have explained any of that. But looking back, I know exactly what I was doing. I was drawing my way out of my own life. What finally pushed everything over the edge was something so minor that most parents wouldn't even remember it by the following weekend. I brought home a B+ in art class. Not math. Not science. Art, the one subject that made me feel like I was alive. I was proud of it, right up until I walked through the front door and saw my mother holding that report card like it was evidence of moral failure. She asked how a girl who supposedly loved drawing could still manage to disappoint her in the only class she claimed to care about. My father suggested maybe I was getting lazy. That night, I heard them talking in the kitchen, their voices low and amused in the way that always made my stomach clench. My mother said I needed a lesson I would never forget. My father said he'd bet money on it. The following morning, they were cheerful in a way that made my skin crawl. My mother made pancakes. My father actually asked if I wanted orange juice. They announced we were taking a day trip into Chicago, just the three of us. And for one desperate, foolish second, I thought maybe something had shifted. Maybe the report card fight was finished. Maybe this was the closest thing to an apology our family could manage. I should have known better. The entire drive from Millbrook into the city felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite identify. My father kept the radio blasting, drumming on the steering wheel like he was in a spectacular mood. My mother kept twisting around from the passenger seat to ask questions she already knew I'd answer carefully. Did I think I was smart? Did I think smart girls were ready for the real world? Did I think life would care whether I was frightened? Every answer I gave seemed to entertain them. Every time I tried to stay quiet, they pushed harder. By the time the skyline came into view, I had that familiar sensation in my chest, the one that whispered something bad was approaching, and I wouldn't be allowed to prepare for it. We parked near Union Station around noon. I had never encountered anything that large or that chaotic up close. The building felt like an entire city compressed beneath a single roof. Business travelers, families, tourists, college students, all of them moving like they had somewhere to be and knew exactly how to get there. I stayed close to my parents because I didn't know where else to stand. Inside the main hall, my mother pointed to a massive pillar near the entrance and told me to wait right there while they moved the car and grabbed lunch. 15 minutes, she said. Maybe 20. I asked if I could go with them. My father laughed so loudly that people turned to stare. My mother leaned close and told me not to embarrass her in public. So I nodded and stayed at that pillar while they walked away. I watched the clock. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Then 45. At first, I told myself the parking was difficult. The food line was long. They'd gotten turned around. An hour in, my chest started aching. An hour and a half in, panic rose so fast it made my hands shake. I had $9 in my pocket. No phone. No address written down. No idea how the train system worked. I had never felt smaller in my entire life. I started taking a few steps from the pillar and then rushing back because they had told me not to move, and even then, some part of me was still terrified of doing the wrong thing. The station grew louder as the afternoon stretched on. Every announcement over the speakers made my heart lurch. Every dark-haired woman made me spin around. Every second felt deliberately, personally cruel. Then I saw the car through the front windows, moving slowly past the street outside. Our car, gliding past the curb. My whole body exploded with relief so powerful I nearly laughed. I sprinted toward the glass, waving both arms, and for one blinding moment, I genuinely believed they had come back for me. My father was driving. My mother was in the passenger seat. Both of them were looking directly at me. My father smiled first. Not the relieved smile of someone who'd just located a lost child. The smile of someone watching a punchline land exactly as planned. My mother rolled her window down and leaned out just far enough for her voice to carry over the traffic. "I bet $50 you can't even find your way home." Then she laughed. My father laughed with her. He lifted one hand off the steering wheel in a lazy thumbs up, like they were congratulating themselves on a performance well executed. Then the car rolled forward and dissolved into traffic. That was the moment the world changed its shape. It was one thing to fear they might forget me. It was one thing to suspect I was being subjected to another lesson. It was something else entirely to watch them choose it, to see them enjoy it, to understand in an instant that my fear wasn't a side effect of what they were doing. It was the entire point. A stranger's voice broke me out of my paralysis. Someone brushed past and muttered, "Excuse me," and the sound of it snapped me back into my body. I ran back inside because I didn't know what else to do. I wandered from one end of that station to the other, crying on and off, wiping my face every few minutes because I was still ashamed to be seen falling apart. My parents had conditioned that reflex into me too. I tried to think of someone I could call. There was no one. I tried to picture the route home. Home might as well have been another country. I sat on a bench, stood back up, walked in circles until my legs ached. At some point, I stopped expecting them to return. At some point, waiting ended and abandonment began. That shift might sound subtle, but when you're 12 years old, it feels like falling through ice into black water. I spent close to 3 hours inside Union Station after they drove away. Long enough for the light outside to begin changing color. Long enough for the crowds to thin and refill. Long enough that I stopped thinking in complete sentences and started moving purely on instinct. I avoided the doors because I was terrified of stepping into the city and getting even more lost. I avoided the police because my parents had always warned me that involving authorities would make everything worse. I avoided strangers because the same people who had abandoned me had spent years drilling into me that asking for help was weakness. Looking back, that was perhaps the cruelest layer of what they'd done. They had trained me to distrust the very thing that could have saved me quickly. The person who finally noticed me was a station employee named Rosa. She was in her 50s, with tired eyes and the kind of steady, quiet voice that made you want to tell the truth even when you were frightened. She had apparently watched me pass the same row of seats and vending machines multiple times. She stopped me near a hallway leading to the administrative offices. She asked how long I'd been waiting. I said I didn't know. She asked if I'd eaten anything. That question broke me completely. I started crying so hard I could barely breathe. Every ounce of shame I'd been swallowing since noon came apart in one ugly, unstoppable flood. I told her they had left me. I told her they'd driven past the station and laughed. I told her my mother had placed a bet on whether I could find my way home. Rosa didn't react the way my parents would have. She didn't tell me to calm down. She didn't accuse me of being dramatic. She crouched slightly so her face was level with mine and said very clearly, "You are safe right now and I am going to help you." Security was called. Then transit police. One officer took my statement while another reviewed the station cameras covering the front entrance. They confirmed I'd been standing there for hours and that a vehicle matching my description had slowed near the curb before pulling away. That documentation mattered later. At the time, all I knew was that the adults around me had suddenly become very serious. One officer asked for my parents' names, our home address, the name of the stores. Another brought me water and crackers because I hadn't eaten since breakfast. When they finally reached my parents by phone, I could only hear half the conversation. But I'll never forget the expression on that officer's face. It moved from cautious professionalism to open disbelief in roughly 10 seconds. He asked if they were heading back to Chicago immediately. Then he went quiet for a long moment. Listened. Then he said, "No, ma'am. Leaving a 12-year-old in a major transit hub is not a parenting lesson. It is child abandonment." My whole body went cold hearing those words. Not because they sounded too harsh. Because they fit perfectly. By early evening, I was sitting in a small interview room with a social worker while a formal report was being prepared. She explained that because my parents were refusing to return immediately and were still framing this as a deliberate parenting decision, I couldn't simply be sent home, even if they later changed their position. There would be an emergency placement while family court reviewed the case. I didn't understand most of the legal language, but I understood her face. She believed me. More than that, she believed I hadn't been safe long before that afternoon. I was frightened when they told me I'd spend the night with a foster family. I had grown up on dark stories about what happened to children who were removed from their homes. But then I met James and Carol Bennett. They weren't glamorous. They weren't performing perfection. James was a wildlife photographer with ink stains on his hands from handling prints. Carol was an elementary school teacher who smelled faintly like hand lotion and classroom paper. Their house was warm and slightly cluttered in a way that felt inhabited rather than chaotic. A lamp glowed in the entryway. Family photos lined the hallway walls. A dog bed sat empty in the corner, while the dog itself slept somewhere deeper in the house. Carol asked if I wanted pasta or soup. James asked whether I preferred the hall light on or off when I went to sleep. Nobody made me feel stupid for not knowing. Nobody laughed when I started crying at the dinner table after 2 bites, too exhausted to keep pretending I was fine. That first night in their guest room, I barely slept. Every car door outside made me flinch. Every creak in the hallway made me sit bolt upright. But even through all of that fear, one thought kept circling. A stranger at a train station had shown me more genuine kindness in 5 minutes than my own mother had shown me in years. I didn't have the language for it yet. I only knew that the world had suddenly revealed itself to be different from everything I'd been taught. And once you witness that other people are truly capable of protecting you, of being safe, it becomes impossible to keep calling cruelty normal. The days that followed felt like living inside someone else's existence. I moved from the Bennett home to meetings with social workers, then to therapy evaluations, then to a family court building where adults spoke in careful, measured voices about my future as though it were both fragile and urgently important. My parents arrived with a lawyer and the exact same attitude they'd maintained at home. Calm. Offended. Faintly amused that anyone was taking this so seriously. My mother wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings as though looking composed would overwrite what she had done. My father sat with his arms crossed like a man enduring an inconvenience he would eventually outlast. They didn't deny leaving me at Union Station. That was the part one couldn't wrap my mind around. They admitted it openly. They simply insisted it had been controlled, educational, necessary. My mother said they'd been trying to build resilience. My father said children in this country had become too soft and someone needed to teach them how the world actually operated. I sat across from them listening to this, and I realized something that altered me almost as profoundly as the train station itself. They were never going to become the kind of people who understood what they had done. If they'd been capable of that honesty, they would have turned the car around before they ever reached the freeway. The court-appointed therapist's report described a documented pattern of emotional abuse, humiliation, neglect, and escalating endangerment. Those weren't my words. But hearing them spoken aloud felt like oxygen flooding a sealed room. For years, I had believed my childhood was somehow my own fault, because that was easier than accepting that the people responsible for me had been choosing harm deliberately. The report made it plain. This hadn't been a misunderstanding. It hadn't been a strict parenting philosophy taken too far. It had been abuse dressed in middle-class vocabulary. When the judge asked whether I wanted to return home while the court monitored the family, I said no so quickly the answer seemed to surprise even me. My mother stared at me like I'd physically struck her. My father muttered something under his breath about ingratitude. The judge didn't flinch. The next phase was supposed to be a path toward reunification, parenting classes, family therapy, supervised visits, regular reviews. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In reality, my parents treated it like a public insult. They hated the idea of being evaluated. They hated oversight. They hated that teachers, therapists, and court officers now had access to the private face of the family they had spent years polishing for everyone else. My father complained more about damage to the store's reputation than he did about losing custody of his daughter. My mother kept insisting the state had no right to tell her how to raise her own child. And then, in the most significant moment of the entire case, they were given a choice. Commit to a 2-year reunification program and fulfill every requirement the court imposed, or voluntarily surrender their parental rights. They chose surrender. Just like that. My chest didn't shatter in that courtroom the way you might expect. It went strangely, completely still. I had spent my entire childhood trying to be good enough to keep them from turning on me. And in the end, they handed me away rather than admit they were wrong. That was the truth that stayed with me longest. They didn't lose me because the system took me. They traded me away to protect their pride. After that, things moved with surprising speed. James and Carol were already licensed foster parents, and over the following months, they became something far greater. James started setting aside photography books and art magazines for me because he'd noticed how constantly I drew. Carol knocked before entering my room, which sounds like such a small thing until you've grown up in a house where privacy didn't exist as a concept. They learned which foods made me anxious because of punishments once tied to dinner. They stopped asking me to make eye contact when I was overwhelmed. They didn't demand love or gratitude or instant trust. They simply stayed. Steadiness feels almost supernatural to a child who has never once experienced it. The adoption was finalized after the required time had passed. But emotionally, it had already happened long before the judge signed the final paperwork. When I was asked if I wanted to change my name, I didn't hesitate for even a second. Jennifer Caldwell belonged to a girl who had stood in a crowded train station with $9 and no idea whether she'd be alive or invisible to her own family before the day ended. Elena Hargrove belonged to someone else entirely. Someone with a room of her own, a desk covered in art supplies, a family that didn't laugh when she was frightened. I still remember the first night after the adoption became official. Carol put fresh sheets on my bed the way she always did on Sundays. James left a brand new sketchbook on my desk. Nobody made a speech about how fortunate I ought to feel. They acted like I had always been theirs. That quiet certainty healed more in me than any dramatic moment ever could. It taught me that real love doesn't test you to prove you've earned it. Real love makes room for you before you even know how to relax into it. Healing didn't happen all at once. It didn't follow a straight line. People love stories where one act of rescue fixes everything, where the damaged child immediately blossoms the moment she's placed in a better home. My life was nothing like that. For years, my body still treated kindness like it might be a trap. If Carol said she'd be back in 15 minutes after a quick errand, I had to actively fight the urge to stand at the window watching for her car. If James was late picking me up from an after-school activity, I could feel panic building so rapidly my hands went numb. I hated waiting in public places. I hated being told to stay put. I hated the phrase, "I'll be right back." Therapy helped, but it was painstaking, slow work. The kind that requires you to say ugly truths out loud, over and over, until your nervous system gradually starts believing what your mind already knows. I learned words like trauma, emotional abuse, hypervigilance. I learned that enduring repeated harm doesn't make you stronger in the way that cruel people claim. It makes you exquisitely skilled at detecting danger and absolutely terrible at rest. Through all of it, the Bennetts never rushed me. They came to school events, helped with homework, remembered which topics triggered me, and let me keep my bedroom door closed whenever I needed space. They didn't try to erase what had happened. They helped me build a life where it was no longer the only thing defining me. Art evolved from escape into something more, structure, language, proof that I could create something beautiful without anyone's permission. I poured everything into it through high school, then through college applications, then through every portfolio review and late-night studio session after I was accepted into the Art Institute of Chicago. Moving back toward the city that had once terrified me wasn't symbolic at first. It was practical. The program was right for me. The school was exceptional. But somewhere during those years, I realized I was reclaiming something. The same city where I had once been abandoned became the place where I constructed myself from scratch. After graduation, I took a position with a branding firm in Portland specializing in small business identity work. For the first time in my life, I lived far enough from Illinois that geography itself felt like an ally. Portland gave me space. New streets, new habits, new rhythms. Eventually, I began taking freelance clients on the side, then launched my own studio. I built a reputation for clean, honest visual storytelling, the kind of work that helps people communicate clearly who they are and what they stand for. The irony wasn't lost on me. My entire career had grown from the fact that I'd spent a childhood trapped inside someone else's carefully maintained lies. I met Daniel through a mutual friend at a rooftop gathering. He was a structural engineer, patient in a way that didn't feel rehearsed, remarkably difficult to rattle. On our third date, I mentioned I had complicated family history. On our fifth, I told him a little more. Months later, when I finally described Union Station, he didn't interrupt, didn't overreact, didn't offer me some hollow line about how everything happens for a reason. He just reached across the table, took my hand, and said quietly, "That should never have happened to you." The simplicity of it nearly undid me completely. We built our life together the same way I had rebuilt myself, slowly, deliberately, with room for honesty at every turn. We got married in a small ceremony with James walking me down the aisle and Carol fixing the back of my dress while trying very hard not to cry. We adopted a rescue dog named Scout, a scruffy mutt with one bent ear and the cautious soul of something that had also been left behind too early. I blocked every account my biological parents ever attempted to use to reach me. Old email addresses, social media platforms, everything. I changed my phone number once after a holiday voicemail from an Illinois number left me shaking for a solid hour. I didn't speak about them unless absolutely necessary. I didn't return to Millbrook. I didn't use my old name. Most days I could go entire weeks without Jennifer Caldwell crossing my mind at all. That was the life I had built by the time those missed calls appeared on my screen. A solid marriage. A studio with loyal clients. Morning walks with Scout. Dinners with friends. Sunday video calls with James and Carol. A life so quiet, so genuinely whole, that sometimes I caught myself wondering whether peace always felt this surprising to people who hadn't spent their childhoods fighting for every small piece of it. Then my phone lit up with 29 missed calls from Illinois. And the ground beneath all of it shifted. There was a voicemail. Then an email from an address I didn't recognize. Then a connection request on LinkedIn, the one platform I'd kept public because of my work. That last detail told me everything. Someone had put in real effort. Someone had finally connected Elena Hargrove to the frightened girl they'd once laughed at through a moving car window. I sat at the kitchen counter with my phone in both hands while Scout pressed warmly against my leg and Daniel watched my face go white. I had spent 20 years making sure the past stayed buried. Whatever was happening now had dug it up with both hands. The voicemail wasn't from my mother. It was from my younger sister, Lily. I hadn't heard her voice since she was a small girl trailing behind me through the hallway in mismatched socks, too young to understand why the air in our house always felt charged and dangerous. Her voice sounded older now. Rougher. The way voices sound when life has pressed hard on them for a long time. She said our mother had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer. Our father had suffered a mild stroke 6 months earlier. The stores were gone, not struggling, gone. Shuttered one by one, sold off at losses, after the family story I had assumed was safely buried in court records resurfaced in the most damaging way imaginable. A relative had posted about the Union Station incident in a local Facebook group after my mother, in a breathtaking act of hypocrisy, had left a comment on a stranger's parenting post about how children today needed stronger discipline. That one comment opened the floodgates. Old neighbors started sharing memories. A retired court clerk hinted that the rumors were entirely true. Someone located an old newspaper brief about a custody matter tied to a minor abandonment investigation. A former store employee described what my parents had been like behind closed doors. The image they had spent decades carefully constructing collapsed in public, fast and ugly. Customers stopped coming. People drove to chain stores in neighboring towns rather than spend another dollar with them. Church friends went quiet. Civic organizations stopped returning their calls. The same small town that had once protected them behind layers of polite gossip turned on them using those exact same tools. Lily told me they were living in a subsidized apartment on the outskirts of town now. No house. No stores. No social standing. No version of the old family left to hide inside. Then she said the line that told me exactly why there had been 29 missed calls instead of one respectful message. They wanted me to come back. Not because they had become different people. Not because time had made them honest. Because they were out of options and terrified of dying alone and unloved. I asked Lily why she was calling, knowing everything she knew about why I'd disappeared. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Because I wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't lying to you." She told me she had cut contact too, not decades ago but recently, after becoming a mother herself and finally requesting copies of the court documents to understand what had truly happened when I vanished from the family. Our parents had spent years feeding her a softened version of events, that I had overreacted, that the state had overreached, that I had been manipulated by foster parents who simply wanted a daughter. Lily said reading those actual records felt like being hit by a truck. She looked at her own little boy afterward and knew with absolute certainty she could never allow people like that near him. Hearing that should have felt triumphant. Instead, it made me feel tired in a place far deeper than anger. She asked if I would come. I said I'd think about it. Daniel told me I owed them nothing. Carol told me that whatever I decided, it had to be for my peace, not their comfort. James said very quietly that some people only go looking for the bridge after they've already burned the house down. I sat with that all night. By morning, one thing was clear. I wasn't going back to rescue them. I was going back to end it on my own terms. In my own voice. I flew into Chicago 2 days later and drove the rest of the way to the hospital where my mother was receiving treatment. The room smelled like disinfectant and stale fear. My father looked older than I'd imagined, smaller too, as though illness and public disgrace had finally stripped him down to the ordinary, frightened man underneath the performance he'd maintained for decades. My mother still had that instinctively arranged expression, even lying half-sick in a hospital bed. As though dignity were something she could apply like makeup. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my mother started crying before I had even sat down. Not a quiet cry. The kind built to pull focus, to demand a response. She said my name. My old name. I corrected her once and only once. Elena. She nodded, dabbing at her face. My father said they'd made mistakes. Mistakes. That comfortable, cowardly word people reach for when the truth is too ugly to say plainly. I told them no. A mistake is missing a highway exit. A mistake is forgetting milk at the grocery store. What they had done was deliberate. They had left a 12-year-old girl alone in a major train station in a city she didn't know. They had laughed while she waved desperately at their car window. Then they had spent 20 years constructing lies to protect themselves from the consequences of that choice. My father started to speak, probably to explain, to contextualize, to reframe, but I hadn't flown across the country to listen to another defense wrapped in more careful language. I told them they had transformed my terror into a game. And the reason they were sitting here now, without a business, without respect, without a single daughter willing to answer their calls, was because games end. People find out. Children grow up. And truth has a way of catching up, even in small towns that believe silence can bury anything permanently. My mother asked if I could forgive them. I told her forgiveness wasn't a debt I owed to people who only came searching for me when their own lives fell apart. Then I said the sentence I had been carrying in some form since I was 12 years old. You bet on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just didn't come back to yours. They both cried then. But for the first time in my life, their tears didn't move me. I wasn't cruel. I didn't yell. I didn't insult them. That surprised me most of all. Because when the moment finally came, revenge didn't feel loud or violent or satisfying in the way I'd sometimes imagined it might. It felt cold, clear, exact, like setting something down that had been far too heavy for far too long. I told them I would not be managing their medical care, paying outstanding bills, or restoring any form of contact. I told them Lily had every right to protect her child from them. I told them my family was in Oregon and in Illinois, with the people who had actually earned that word. Then I stood up. My father asked if this was really goodbye. I looked at him steadily and said, "It's been goodbye for 20 years. You're just the last people to understand that." I walked out after 20 minutes and didn't look back. In the parking lot outside, the air felt thin and sharp and impossibly bright. I stood there with my hands trembling, not from regret, but from the strange, unfamiliar release that comes when something that has haunted you for decades finally takes on a shape you can walk away from and leave behind. On the flight home, I thought about the little girl at Union Station. The one who had believed that being abandoned meant being unwanted forever. She had been wrong. She was unwanted by two broken people who had mistaken cruelty for strength. But she was not unworthy of love. There is a difference between those two things. And learning that difference, truly understanding it in your body, not just your mind, saved my life. If there's anything worth taking from what happened to me, it's this. Abuse doesn't transform into discipline just because a parent uses more sophisticated language for it. Humiliation does not build character. Fear doesn't make children stronger. It only makes them older before their time, hyper-aware of danger and incapable of rest. And walking away from people who cause you harm, even if they share your blood, even if society tells you that you owe them loyalty simply for existing, is not bitterness. Sometimes it is the most profound act of self-respect you will ever manage. I did not leave that hospital room feeling guilty. I left it feeling educated by my own survival. The family you are born into can carve deep wounds into you. But it does not get to define what grows from those wounds. Real love does not laugh when you are scared. Real family does not test whether you can survive without them. Real healing begins the moment you stop calling cruelty a lesson and start calling it exactly what it always was. And once you do that, you can build a life so honest, so steady, so filled with earned peace, that not even the people who broke you can reach far enough to take it back.